So, what I'm going to do as an opening gambit is to ask each of the panelists to talk for 4 or 5 minutes, maybe even 6 or 7 minutes, about their relationship to Le Guin, how they discovered Le Guin, how they feel about Le Guin, what kind of influence, positive or negative, Le Guin might have had on them. Nora?
Are we talking Le Guin in general or specifically Earthsea?
No, we are talking Le Guin in general. You may choose any number of books.
Okay, or short stories.
Indeed.
Because the probably most influential Le Guin experience that I had was reading The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Oh, well, okay. Just a second. I think I had not been much into writing short stories until relatively recently in my life. And in fact, for many years I was sort of snobbishly and foolishly convinced that, well, I'm going to be a novelist, I don't need to know short stories, they're a different art form. And then I met a number of professionals in the field who verbally slapped me and said, that's silly, get over it, and learning to read and write short stories will make you a better novel writer. So I promptly set out to try and read a number of classic short stories of the genre. And the one that first rocked my socks off, blew my mind, etc., was that one. And I remember reading it and putting it down and just kind of being like in shock, in pain, because it's a painful story, and it is intentionally meant to disturb you, meant to make you think, meant to disrupt your conception, not just of fantasy, but of the real world that you live in. And so the first thing that I kind of realized upon reading this was that science fiction and fantasy could and really should be and was best when it really struck home in that kind of powerful, painful way. And I began to realize that my own fiction at that point was too gentle. So I started at that point, and I kind of felt like I should write more about real world subject matter, colonialism, oppression, things that were really kind of real to my existence and real to my knowledge of the world, but I felt like I was writing fantasy, it was supposed to fit a certain formula. That broke me out of the formula. That made me realize, no, wait, that's really not how it's supposed to be. And I will keep this brief, but right around the same time, I actually encountered a fairly lengthy essay by another black female science fiction fan named Pam Knowles, which is still floating around on the internet somewhere, called Shame. You can Google it. And she basically wrote about, this was in maybe 2003 or 4, she was writing about her experience of being a young black woman trying to read and enjoy science fiction and fantasy, and never seeing anything of herself in it. And being told by her father, stop reading that stuff, it doesn't respect you, it's not good for you. There's never anybody in those futures that you're reading about that looks like you. Are we all dead? And so her first experience with inclusiveness in science fiction and fantasy was Earthsea, and I have the ugly copy. I'm sorry, everybody's got all these pretty copies. I have the one with the Sci-Fi Channel cover. I'm so sorry. Speaking of inclusiveness,
I got the Lovecraft cover.
Oh well, all right. And she's speaking of the experience of reading this story and realizing that Guin was not white. And realizing that this is an entire world of people, for the most part, with the exception of the cards, who are not white. And realizing that this is a writer who has made a world that actually included people that looked like her, and just how special and powerful that experience was to her. So at that point I began to realize more just how real world impact this fantastic speculative material that we could have. And I began to write sharper and harder because of her.
Ellen?
Just as a little footnote to what you were saying, for Pam Knowles' dad and everybody else, you're all invited. October 24 is what, Monday? There's going to be another panel here at the center. You all have flyers on you're all sitting on them, right? It's Outsiders in and of Science Fiction and the Fantastic. I'll be moderating Chip Delaney, Andrea Hairston, Carlos Hernandez, Elia Don Johnson, and Steve Berman. And I feel this is one of the bad raps that science fiction and fantasy, particularly science fiction, get, and I can't wait to dig into it next Monday, so do please come back then. Yeah. I was sort of first generation early adapter Le Guin because I was in high school and I actually wrote an essay about this that got included in this book I brought because I did want you to see it. Le Guin turned 80 a couple of years ago, and Karen Joy Fowler and Debbie Notkin got a whole bunch of people to do memories and reflections on her. It's a lovely little book from Aqueduct Press, a small press out of Seattle, and very much worth getting. It has a really nice bio, long bio of Le Guin as well, with all the juicy tidbits I wanted to know about her when I was a teenager and totally obsessed with her. So how this came about was I was in high school, and I was in J.R.R. Tolkien High School, which was that, my class of person all read Tolkien and wrote each other notes in Tengwar, because that's what there was then. I am pre-D&D. Like, we didn't even have nerds. We were so weird we didn't even have a name. But we had Tolkien and we had each other. And so it was all Tolkien, Tolkien, Tolkien all the time.
SCA.
Yeah, and SCA, I did just, finally I got to kiss me if I went to SCA. And so anyway, we was all Tolkien all the time. That was it. That was what fantasy was. And my best friend, her mom had brought this book home from the library for her, saying, "Oh look, Ursula K has written a novel," because she had gone to Radcliffe with Ursula K. It always sounded like Lucy to me. And my friend read it and said, "It's not bad. Here, you read it." And I read it, and it was like everything changed, and I became a traitor to my people because I liked A Wizard of Earth. I still can't even say it. I liked A Wizard of Earthsea better than Tolkien. I literally couldn't tell anyone because it was like heresy. And I won't take up the panel now with thinking about why, but you know why, because you've read them both, and you know what would appeal to someone in the one and what would appeal to someone in the other. Thus was launched my absolute worship of Le Guin. And at that point, so she and I were going neck and neck. She would write a new book, and I would read it and be blown away and have my life change. She became in some ways my spirit guide. At one point I had almost forgotten this, but for several years she was it. She was the person I wanted to be, the writer I wanted to be. I mean, and I can't say it was because it was a woman writer or any of those things. It was just she was it. She was writing, I guess, the things that I wished I had written and I could write. And so when I say she was my spirit guide, I mean that I had dreams in which she spoke to me. Not on purpose and not frequently, but every now and then I would have a Le Guin dream in which she sort of validated me or made fun of me or, whatever it was. That's how intense my feelings for this writer were. And I see from some people's faces that I'm not the only one who has this experience. And I changed spirit guides when I was about 23 and got a different spirit. I just look back at this now and realize that's what I was doing. It's another writer whom I came to admire very much and started having dreams about her instead of Le Guin. It's very interesting. So anyway, I did finally, which is also to say, yes, there was an end to that period of complete obsession and worship, but she really did change my life, change my vision of what fantasy could and should be, and help me see the direction I wanted to go as a writer, which is odd because, like John Wray, what I write is nothing at all like Le Guin, I don't think.
Except for that one novel. You mentioned one novel.
Well, I said it was more like, but I was bullshitting. And as I said it, I thought, well, because it's more like traditional fantasy, but she hasn't really written that much traditional fantasy. Most of my stuff is very much about cities, and it's very non-traditional. She writes a lot about cities too, so I don't know, maybe. But certainly, and she was also writing in reaction to Tolkien. I mean, she was the generation that had to write fantasy in reaction to Tolkien, but she was doing, instead of Christian, she was doing Taoist, and, and she was fantastic. Anyway, I would love at some point, if we have the time on this panel, to talk about influences and why we don't write like the people that we love, because I know it's true for me. I'd be interested to hear what you thought. But anyway, I finally got to meet her, thanks to David Hartwell. Because when I worked in publishing, he was a very generous boss, and he took me to lunch with all the famous writers that came through the office. And the day that I had lunch with Ursula and her agent and David at the Algonquin, it was good.
Yeah, actually, it was really fun for me too.
Except, and I'm sure she had didn't remember it one day later, but oh my word. No, that's not true. I sent her a story. You were doing an anthology, and I sent her a story. And how could I have forgotten this? So I got rejected by Ursula Le Guin. But here's what she said. She said, "I'm sure this is very brilliant, but I don't understand a word of it." Can you imagine how that makes you feel coming from your spirit? Congratulations!
Oh my.
She didn't buy it.
Now, Michael.
Well, when I realized I would have to talk about what Le Guin's influence on the field was, I thought, well, what is her influence on the field? And I thought, well, what's the influence of salt in the ocean? And it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it helps to keep in mind that I dedicated my life to fiction at age 16 in 1966. And I published my first story in 1980. In that time, when literature's your all and you are unpublished, are the most important years in your career. And during those years was when Le Guin was putting out all the works that astonished people. Now after that, she was still doing works, incredibly good works, but it was no longer astonishing. It's like, oh, well, another place from you, from Mr. Shakespeare. Thank you very much. I just leave it there on the inbox. And during that period, when I was writing really badly and working really hard, every now and then Le Guin would come out with usually with a short story, and you'd see it and you'd be very excited because something important was going to happen here. And what was happening there was she was expanding what was possible to write, to say, within science fiction and fantasy. And now she came out of the New Age, and she came out of this ethos that people believed inherently there was no contradiction between high literature and science fiction at all. And if you look at her work, you can see that all the way through, that she has, this is what she believed. This is not what people earlier in that period believed. And in fact, right now, people are tending to backslide from that a little bit, but that is still the church that I worship in. And
Amen.
She would come out with something like Earthsea. I forget what there was a story that came out before us, an Earthsea story, like the rule of names or something like that.
The rule of names.
The rule of names, which was like the seed that came in. And at that time, if science fiction was an underdog, fantasy wasn't even a dog. It was.
He's right.
Yeah, it was out in the gutter. It was something nobody would let into the house. And but fantasy was very important to me, and I read that, and I said something really important going on here. I had no idea how much I was underestimating her by saying that, because that was the seed that the Earthsea books grew out of and expanded into. All the time, Le Guin was one of those people who just expanded the frontiers of what was possible, just raised the limit. The Encyclopedia of Science Fiction and Fantasy says she was one of the two or three most important writers of the late 20th century in science fiction. The Encyclopedia of Fantasy does not say that, and I think only because we don't really have as good a picture of fantasy as we do of science fiction. I think she's also one of the 2 or 3 most important of the late 20th century for fantasy. And the value of somebody saying, no, that's not how good you can be that good, is incalculable. And it forces anybody who's at all serious to just raise their sights and sort of roll up the sleeves and sigh, because you realize there's a lot of work ahead.
John?
Well, I think my initial encounter with Le Guin was a little bit different, simply because I was very much of the D&D generation, if you have to call it that. And I think by the time I encountered the Earthsea book, she was already very much part of the sort of fantasy canon. Which is not to say that she didn't blow my mind when I read these Earthsea books. I mean, they're just so, they're also, I mean, the economy of the books also, you know? I mean, you're sort of comparing apples and oranges in a way if you try to compare Le Guin and Tolkien, because Tolkien was sort of so incredibly expansive in appendix after appendix, and there are all the other books that you're supposed to consult to even just appreciate the actual novels. But then you have a book like Wizard of Earthsea that's just so, there's so much in so economically and so vividly in such a short period of time. I think that's also something that in fantasy was not necessarily, even just formally, you know, she innovated in ways that I think were significant. And then, you know, so I read her when I was this sort of intense D&D fantasy geek, and I actually have to confess, I think it's like heresy or something, but I only went back and read her sort of adult sci-fi starting a few years ago. And that was just a second kind of awakening for me, and really just quite a glorious experience. I mean, The Dispossessed, which also has a certain economy. I mean, it states everything so simply, and presents its case so elegantly, and yet with such economy. So in a way, I was lucky to sort of get bowled over by her twice at two extremely distinct ages and periods of receptivity for me. So yeah, it's awfully fun to be talking about her in this context too.
Sure. Well, Ellen said that I should tell my first encounter story. When I was in graduate school at Columbia in 1968, I got behind in my reading of science fiction, and I had this big box of 8 books from like 1965 to 1968 that I hadn't read yet. And so I had missed the advent of Ursula K. During those years. And however, I had been reading a lot of short fiction in science fiction, and I was introduced to Toby Roxburgh, the editor at Walker Books, because I was told that he was starting a new science fiction line. And I wanted to edit an anthology. And Toby was very good to me. He was very pleasant and very friendly. And he did tell me, in effect, go away, kid. But he also said, would you like a copy of this new science fiction novel that we're launching lists with? It's, you know, the best science fiction novel of the decade. And I said, really? Who's it by? And he said, Ursula K. Guin. And I looked at him, I said, who? And he said, read it. You know, and I said, okay. Now, I was quite confused because I had read maybe 2,000 science fiction books at that point. I was an indefatigable reader of science fiction. By the time I was 11, I had read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paperback originals and library books and magazines, but not in the last 4.5 years. And I read the book, and it was The Left Hand of Darkness, and I said, by God, he may be right. You know, this is the decade in which Walter Miller published A Canticle for Leibowitz, and Chip Delaney published Nova and other novels, and Tom Dish published Genocides, and you know, there were a lot of good books in that decade. Stranger in a Strange Land, you know, Dune. Left Hand of Darkness may be the best book of that decade. And 5 years later, I had an editorial job, and I was Le Guin's editor for a short while, until I changed companies 4 years after that. But I did the Word for Wordless Forest and other books, and I got to know her. And so when I changed jobs and hired Ellen for when I was at Simon & Schuster, we got to go to lunch. Now, I think that having got this far in the discussion, we should talk about science fiction for a few minutes, if we can. Do you feel comfortable with that, Ellen?
I can always pass if I don't have an answer.
Do you have a favorite science fiction novel by Ursula?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Jeez. Her whole opus I loved because they're all interconnected, at least the early ones. I would have to say Dispossessed hit me at a point in my life where it really, really mattered, where I needed to be reading that book. But aesthetically, I think my favorite one was Left Hand of Darkness. I was almost too young to read it. I think, like John, I should reread it now. I think I would get a very different experience from it. But you know, what I always try to explain to people when I'm who think they don't like science fiction, that they can read science fiction that they'll like. I cast her, I sort of explain that she's social science fiction. That she's actually writing, yes, I mean, she's got some spaceships and she's done some research on the science, but that to me, her potency as a scientist, science fiction writer, is that she's doing social science. Her father was one of the great founders of American anthropology. She comes by it honestly. But sometimes I try to calm people down because they think it's all going to be gears and rocket ships and things like that.
Yeah.
That I know she's not the only social scientist, but I think that she's one of the greats. And in that regard, I can read a lot of social science fiction. And I'm not as much of a historian as you and Michael are. Was she the cutting edge of social science fiction? I mean, did she contribute that, or was she just part of the wave?
At that time, in the 1970s, she and Michael Bishop were the cutting edge of social anthropological science fiction. And The Dispossessed, when it came out, was the book that put her over the top in terms of her literary reputation, because John Updike reviewed it in the New Yorker long and favorably. This was an astonishing thing to happen to a science fiction novel. It was unparalleled in the decade. I was at that time also Robert A. Heinlein's editor. He was a very famous science fiction writer, and he said that, to me, that he thought that Ursula K. Le Guin was the best writer of this generation in science fiction.
So people didn't mind that she wasn't writing traditional science fiction?
She was writing really good science fiction.
Yeah, and you didn't have to write traditional science fiction then. The field was blown wide open. She was one of the people who was like expanding the field, but there were people doing strange things all over the place. Anything was allowed if it was good enough. Brian Aldiss wrote a novel about excrement called The Dark Light Years, communicating with aliens by excreting. It's like, I don't want to go into it. But you could get away with anything back then.
Yeah, I remember George Alec Evinger's first novel was What Entropy Means to Me.
I love that book.
I loved it too, but from a kind of traditional science fictional point of view, it was white noise.
Is that why you wanted to bring up science fiction?
Yeah. I wanted to bring up science fiction because of Le Guin's works were crucial in bringing a kind of literary attention to science fiction that it had not received heretofore.
I also think, not that I'm in any way an expert, but I feel as though with Le Guin you always have a sense that her innovations and her experimentations were born of, occurred for a reason, you know, and that they were the sort of things that actually had a sort of tremendous degree of thought and also message behind it. There was nothing, I don't think there's anything sort of exhibitionistic about the ways in which she extended and experimented and expanded the field. Maybe as opposed to the excrement novel, for example, you know. Although I actually kind of have to read that. Is that too much information?
It's actually pretty. It's actually a Swiftian novel, and it's pretty funny.
Oh, it is pretty funny.
Long out of print, but you can get it. Laura, do you have any favorite Le Guin science fiction stories?
I will confess here that I haven't read a lot of Le Guin's novels.
Okay.
I have read The Lathe of Heaven and The Left Hand of Darkness. I
Okay.
read both. They are, I can't rank them. So thus far, I'm leaning in the direction of The Left Hand of Darkness, but I think that's what most people kind of choose.
You know, I haven't
So,
really? Let's not do that.
okay.
Well, you know, I'll let the rest of the panelists talk about it for a moment and make one comment myself. When it came out, Le Guin was a big fan of the work of Philip K. Dick. And Lathe of Heaven was her homage to Philip K. Dick. It's not like Le Guin's other science fiction novels and not like her other stories.